Hi, this is going to be a bit of an unusual session. You know the drill. You said kind of ready enough.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I've been reviewing some like concepts, but as much as I can.
Okay. Okay. Well, sounds good. And by the way, this is the nice thing is this is not a real interview, right? I'm not actually planning on hiring you or anything. So all of this is purely for your benefit. And I think it'll be fun to do. So I said there's a little bit of a twist to this. I want to start by asking you what's your current team size and kind of resources? So, like, how many devs do you generally influence on a day to day basis?
Um, my web team is 6 or 7 depending. So we're bringing on a seventh. So
Okay. Yeah.
they're depending on how many clients we need to involve.
Okay. And then the question that I have, which is important first, is how familiar are you with Twitter as a
Uh,
website?
enough.
Enough. Okay,
I
yeah.
would say.
I think that's good. If not, I was gonna say we could switch to Facebook. So here's +1, the volume is very low. Okay, hang on, let me up you a little bit. All right, can you tell me, do you use Twitter? This is just a question for audio testing, not for the interview.
I signed up early and then never really used it, but I lurk a lot.
Okay. Chat, was that volume better? What you just heard? Anyway, let me know if it's not. I'll try to keep an eye on chat just to know about audio volume. But I did up it by like 60% in Discord. Okay, so here's the question, which is, like I said, a little bit of a twist. I'm going to paste it in the document, but I'll read it aloud. With your current team of 6 to 7 people, I want you to design a version of Twitter that you'd be able to complete within a year. So this isn't just the system design. I also want you to think of like what features are going to be most important. And before you start, I want to ask: is that twist of the time frame, is that even interesting to you, or do you just want to do the system design? Because this is your mock interview.
No, I mean it's a thing that I have to think about a lot with working at a startup. So
Okay,
that is
yeah.
always a factor.
Okay, well, that's your task. So you can pursue this however you want. You can use whatever, I type in the document if you want to or anything. I'm going to write my own notes, of course, and I'm going to write them in the document. So maybe just try to scroll to wherever you are in the document so you don't see my stuff and I don't influence you that way.
All right, I'm letting this in another program. Okay, so can I start by asking you some clarifying questions just to make sure that we're thinking of the same output, I guess?
Yeah, sure.
Um, are we doing just the web client? Or are we doing web and mobile?
So this is where I want you to have the time frame come into account, because let's say you took on 10 different clients. It's like, well, you probably couldn't do that in a year. So whatever you think is kind of most important here.
Well, because we could start with React Native and then share components across web and native platforms. That would speed up the time and also let the team do more because they're cross-platform. I guess I'll proceed in that direction because of the timeline factor.
Yeah.
It's Yeah, React Native has pluses and minuses, but doing stuff fast with multiple clients is definitely a plus. Okay, cool. So in terms of the backend of Twitter, we are replicating like, so I'm saying I'm supporting what, like 3 clients, iPhone, Android, and web. Um, and we also have to build the backend as well, right? I'm not just doing the front end parts
So I have to
in
keep
the
kind of
design.
piercing the veil here a little bit. If
Yeah.
you think it would help you to design that sort of thing, then yes, you would. If you
Okay.
really just want to focus on this, so it's like, what's going to give you the most interview benefit? Ideally, I would just say yes, you'd be designing the back end too. So will that help you? Do you want to do that?
Sure. I mean,
Okay.
it'll give me. I guess I'll work backwards from the front. Um, okay, so there's a lot of interactions. We'll definitely need a graph layer. Um, let's see. Maybe I should draw. I should have a paper out, actually. Okay. Um, okay. So, uh, 3 clients. With Twitter scale, we'll need load balancing. Because one server won't support the full load on any one client.
Hmm.
So we'll have 3 clients and those clients will uh, talk to the load balancer. The load balancer will interact with both the web server and graph clients, because I want both of those load balanced.
So
Uh,
I'm gonna interject here and there.
sure.
You mentioned the graph clients a couple of times now. What's the reasoning behind a decision? I'm guessing you're talking about a GraphQL kind of thing, or is it
Mhm.
something different?
Yeah, I mean, we could use GraphQL. It's nice. GraphQL is nice for something like this because there's so many different uh, things that the client is going to ask for, that it's nice if you can give that ability to your front end team to kind of like design the data that they want back for each component.
Hmm.
Especially with React Native or React in general, having the component be able to kind of like design the data that is necessary for that is a nice thing for both maintainability and speed of development.
Hmm.
So that's what I would reach for. I know we can do like if we were in a situation where we could have the backend and the front end in the same repo, we'd have some more options like TRPC, um, so that we wouldn't have to maintain like a whole graph service. That'd be nice, but I think with the scale of, I guess with my team, with the size of my team, that's what I would reach for. With this limitation, uh, we only have a small amount of developers. They're going to be doing the front and back end. I would do it all in a monorepo uh, for just speed of iteration. Um, I would probably reach for something like TRPC in that case because if it's the same engineers working on the back end and the front end, then you don't need to maintain a whole separate service. Um, you can just scale horizontally in terms of the uh, resources
Hmm.
necessary. You do have to start thinking about uh, like nodes and sharding and stuff like that when you get to the when you have these clients distributed, globally, because Twitter has a very international audience. I think most of the traffic comes from the United States, but the support is expected to be global, I assume.
Yeah. Would you maybe change some of these decisions based on having more time?
Yeah, if I wanted to make like a robust client for years to come, I probably would separate the services and uh, design a backend that could be iterated on uh, separately,
Hmm.
more microservice architecture, than doing it all in a monorepo with everything so tightly coupled. I just made that decision for speed.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let me see. You mentioned both Graph and gRPC. I'm not actually sure which one you sort of settled on there because we're talking about the client to backend communication, right?
Mhm.
Do you do you want both? Do you want to pick one? Because I heard pros and cons of both.
If the backend, if so, my team all writes TypeScript primarily, so I would use tRPC,
Hmm.
um, because then we don't have to maintain a graph layer at all,
Yeah.
and the language server is just aware of what's in the backend, and it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's just if you're a feature and you're gonna write the front end for it, you could write the back end for it and have it immediately available in your client without having to do type generation, code generation, anything like that.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds reasonable. So I don't want to steer too much, so I'll
Sure.
leave it at that. Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Yeah. Okay. Um, okay, so let's see. So thinking about the application itself, and then we'll work backwards. We need we're gonna have a lot of users. Do you have any idea how many, like, what the scale of the number of users of Twitter is?
So this is where I would say that I do, but I think you should sort of estimate a napkin math what you think the answer would be.
Okay. Let me Google real quick. So I'm thinking of average daily users, just because I'm evaluating this from a load perspective.
Hmm.
Uh, the first thing that came up was 245 million daily active users. I think that's generous, but you know, we'll need to have a robust API for sure. Uh, in a year to support that many daily active users, I think that would be challenging with the arc with TRPC as the networking layer. You have to factor things like how much of Twitter is um, its API, what percentage of those users are doing API calls at what frequency, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Um, if I take bots out of the equation and we're just thinking of all these people as people using the application, and then we can evaluate bots as a separate, because maybe we roll an API service um, separately for that, and that would prevent us from being blocked on the application layer while being able to do a deliverable later. So another way to access the backend strictly for API.
So let me
Um,
drill into that really quickly. You said uh, you could roll an API service separately. When you say separately, what is it separate from?
so we could have a public graph QL instance, or we could have some kind of public API that accesses the same data, but uh, isn't isn't going to use the same communication method as our TRPC layer.
Okay, okay. And what's the reason for that?
I want to decouple servicing the API clients from delivering the product, so that when we inevitably make like cost benefit analysis decisions,
Hmm.
our primary audience is the users, uh, and the secondary audience is the API. If that is like the financial equation of like, users make more money than the API, I would decouple that so that it could be delivered as a secondary deliverable and maybe unblock the first one.
Okay, okay. I think I see what you're saying. When you said bot users earlier, I thought what you might have been saying is, Twitter has this reputation of having more bots than users almost at this point, but they're acting like users. I think what you're
Mhm.
talking about when you say bots might be people who want to write something using a Twitter API that is intended to be a bot and is never meant to fake anybody out. Is there that distinction that we're making here?
I just don't know what percentage of Twitter's financials, I guess, are the API cost. Like, I know they charge for their API access.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure if like the real product is that, or if the front end client is the desire. If the front end client is the desire, I would prioritize that. If not, then I would prioritize the API. But
Okay.
they probably both need to be there for table stakes.
And is there a way that we could maybe avoid having to even make this distinction?
If we roll the GraphQL, if we have the public and private APIs, um, essentially like replicated, so like you have a privilege, um, some kind of privilege system to determine whether your user is a supported client or is like a external API user. You could write one uh, API service. It's just the support for that will uh, is kind of like a long tail, I think. So we'll have to determine whether the financial targets. I'm thinking in like startup brain, like whether you what customers are you going after initially, and how robust can we do within this time frame?
Okay, got you. Okay, so let's, for the ease of being able to sort of scope this down, let's say you're just targeting human users at first, just kind of people posting on the website.
Cool. Then I mean, the easy, fast way is to use something like TRPC so that, um, you know, and you might make this decision in a startup environment where you want to get something to the users really fast, and then you may have to tack on, an external API eventually for another use case. Um, and then you can migrate the initial client to that so that you have one service. That's like the startup route I would take
Okay.
if I had to.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to make sure that there's some cohort of your audience that's happy at first and that you're meeting needs and ideally taking in revenue and then proceed from there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. So we kind of have we have a load balancer. Like, are we starting from like we're migrating Twitter to this thing?
No, so I guess let's like rewind 15 years. You're the first person to make Twitter.
Okay.
I guess like Twitter never existed or however long
Okay.
ago that was.
Cool. I mean, then I wouldn't even use a load balancer. I would like load balancer would be something I add on when scale starts to be a thing. Um, there's some math you could do, but if you have no app and then you have 200 million users the next day, it's gonna crash if you don't have a load balancer, of course. Uh, but if I was starting a service like this, I would not roll a load balancer as part of my initial deliverable because that's unnecessary optimization.
Okay. How long, let's say you found out you wouldn't scale to 200 million users right off the bat, but let's say you find out within a week of starting the service, okay, there are way more users than we thought. How long would it then take you to add a load balancer to get the infrastructure in place that you might need for scalability? And do you think there'd be an impact to customer happiness or revenue in that time?
Um, yeah, so that is definitely possible. Depending on where you host the backend parts of your service, adding a load balancer could be pretty quick, like on the order of, half a day of work, or it could be extremely difficult if you have to kind of roll something custom. Um, what I would reach for in this situation is probably something that has the potential to add a load balancer quickly initially. Like I would use, um, Google Cloud Services or AWS or something where you can kind of just like pretty simply pack on a load balancer when necessary.
Okay. Yeah, and so if you think about that equation then of, customer happiness and impact to revenue, we're thinking this would minimize it because you'd be able to add a load balancer in quickly.
Mhm.
Are you factoring in things like testing time? Like how are you ensuring that your environment works? Do you have different environments? These are the kinds of things I'm also curious about.
Yeah, so if the real you kind of there's a trade-off to make whether like in client development, there's a trade-off to make whether you want to do vendor lock-in and use Vercel in a situation like this. You get testing and staging environments automatically, uh, like in your GitHub PRs and stuff like that. Um, if you don't do that, you have to roll, uh, you know, we're actually in the process of doing this uh, in my current company, uh, like a Kubernetes orchestration layer
Hmm.
uh, to like when a PR comes in, uh, spin up an environment, that kind of stuff. Though that development process is tricky. We don't on my current team, we don't have a DevOps person that's on another team within the org. So with my team schema, we would probably or my team composition, I think we would probably reach for something like Vercel. It's going to greatly increase the initial cost because you're paying AWS plus Vercel's feature set plus whatever marketing cost is kind of built into that
And
service.
Vercel in particular here. So the way I look at it is you're in like the grocery store of technologies and you're like, I
Yeah.
want to take Vercel into my cart and AWS. What are your reasons for reaching for those technologies?
Um, So my team primarily works on Next.js applications, and so Vercel is kind of the logical choice. I've used other services like Netlify, um, that kind of provide the orchestration on top of AWS so that you don't have to have a person in charge of doing that.
Hmm.
With my current composition of team, I think I would make that choice of to use one of those services. Um, Usually, when you're starting a company like this, you can get a, a huge initial credit grant, you know, uh, either by like applying to like a what's it called? Like a scholarship program, or there's kind of like things you can apply to where they give you like a huge amount of initial credits to basically let you lock yourself into this vendor. Um, that would offset the cost of doing it initially. Uh, but then, after the year, usually you'll have to, start thinking about migration to other services, which becomes expensive.
Okay.
Because we're only thinking about a year, it's viable.
Yeah, well, okay, to be clear here, we're thinking about a year of, there's like an assumption here. You only have so much money to work with, let's say, or these people want some promise of a product that's working. And that if it's successful, you'd be supporting it for many years.
Okay.
Okay, so if I were to just kind of sum up what you've talked about so far, I think you mentioned that you'd start with just gRPC, given your team's expertise. You'd have that as your communication layer to the back end. You would be hosting this on AWS, and you'd be using Vercel or Netlify for some sort of orchestration on top of this. Um, how about we talk about what you're building?
Sure. Yeah, so we will need to break down like the core offering of Twitter. So we have kind of like, I guess you could kind of think of like the database schema almost like you have posts or tweets.
Hmm.
Uh, you have um, users. Users have profiles. Tweets have uh, actions on them, so you could comment. So there's comments. That's another schema. You have, you know, the ability to repost. You have um, like likes, favorites, that kind of stuff. So you need to keep track of favorites by user. I don't remember. Do they have bookmarks? Can you bookmark like a private favorite essentially?
I don't know, but whether or not they have it, you could choose to do that. And I would say you'd
Right.
probably apply whatever prioritization you think is important there.
Yeah. So essentially, like the making the UI of Twitter is like a very small part of the overhead in terms of building it.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, if you search on Google, you can find people making the Twitter interface in like a few hours with
Yeah.
current tooling and stuff like that. So um, that's not really the complicated part. I would get into like what views are we going to ship initially, like as we go. Are we going to ship as we go? Like, are we going to uh, develop in secret and then release at a year mark?
So, what do you think would help provide the most value for you as the development team? Like, if you just want a successful product, which do you think is the better strategy in this case?
Um, Probably like a period of time where we're not shipping to get some minimum viable product uh, built, and
Hmm.
then put that in front of users to get feedback on what we should be building like subsequently.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's reasonable. About how long do you think it would take you to get to an MVP? And maybe we're too early on to ask this question, but about how long do you think it would take you to get there? And then at what cadence would you start shipping updates?
Um, yeah, so I think if I had to just like give my best estimate for having, the ability to have a profile with authentication, uh, be able to post, be able to have users interact with each other. I feel like that is the core functionality of Twitter, and then there's like a bunch of other stuff tacked on. Um, I Within the order of like 4 months, I would say we have like something functional. Um, Maybe less than that if depending on how like robust we want to give them initially.
Okay.
There's kind of like a trade-off you have to make usually when you're building a startup where it might not be the idea that sells something. It might have to be like the way you the way that you interact with some new tool or some new app that become like is the pleasurable part of using it. So like if there's not some delight, there's like something in you have to get to the minimum delightful. I think somebody had said this before. It might have been one of my bosses, but like you're trying to get to the minimum delightful product to try to hook
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
rather than just the minimum feature set.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, so time frame. Um, Given what you said about, I like that you scoped down which methods you're actually going to be building out here. So it sounds like basic like tweets and everything. I want to talk a little bit more now about the storage of everything. And you've mentioned some schemas here. I want to also remind you of some features that Twitter has, which I think are like core Twitter features that you didn't cover necessarily, like tags. So you put a hashtag, and now there's a way of searching by hashtag. There's a way of maybe surfacing, like here are the trending hashtags. But the tags themselves, I think, were pretty core to Twitter. And there's one other thing, maybe like tagging users. So there's a way of me saying like at Beardage, and then you would get a notification about this, and that is what produces that social effect of using the whole platform. So let's at least consider those to be sort of part of the offering. I'm not saying hey that you should keep the same 4 month deadline, but let's talk about that moving on. So let's talk about storage. How might you start to think about these things? How would you where would we be working on the back end of this? What would be facilitating all of this, etc.?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the hashtag thing because I didn't even discuss the search basically uh, as like a huge, fraction of the development probably. Uh, okay, cool. So storage. Firstly, the easy stuff, images and videos will be uh, hosted probably wherever we can find the cheapest storage. Then they'll be delivered via CDN. So like the CDN layer will have the replication usually across nodes. So like you have like edge delivery uh, for the heaviest things you have to ship, images and video. Those are going to be the most expensive over the wire. So you get them as close as you can. So those will be kind of cached in a CDN as close as you can to the end user. Um, usually I would use something like S3 or I forget the Google equivalent, but there's a storage service that Google has, and then you can put a CDN kind of in between to do things like resizing based on the device requesting. Uh, if you need to uh, like transcode video so that it's a smaller delivery format, you have to establish like what you're going to support in terms of what people can upload and what people can view on your clients. So um, that is definitely an expensive thing, but it's a kind of a math you have to do once you have users and you do it per user tier or like however many users you have to kind of multiply that cost.
Yeah. So I want to ask just sort of general breadth question here while we're on the topic of CDN. Any other concerns that you have when it comes to a CDN?
Um, I mean, the CDN probably will eventually have a load balancer equivalent. But usually, what I would consider with the CDN is security, like how are we going to authenticate the request? Is somebody uh, does somebody have the privileges to request this image, and should we send it? That kind of stuff.
Hmm. Okay. And I want to touch on the rest of the storage solution. So you mentioned the CDN for user provided content. I guess Twitter is pretty much entirely user provided content. But what are we using a database for? How are we storing things?
Yeah. So there's some trade-offs you can make with SQL versus NoSQL databases. If I would probably on this time scale, uh, I would choose a database that aligns with the vendor I'm using for everything else.
Hmm.
So, if I was going with Google, I would use Firebase. Um, the problem, the cost associated with Firebase is reads, or like that's like the scaling factor. Uh, Twitter is uniquely read heavy, I think. Depending on how you like how you design your graph, it could be very expensive to do many micro, because you might have a view. Like if you load up Twitter and you see the feed, um, that view may have like 100 different interactions on it.
Yeah.
Um, and if all of those, trigger a read, a write, and a read, uh, one user could really bog down that uh, that process. So I think you would want a caching layer. Um, you could use something like Redis, or even like a search service to prevent you from having to duplicate reads. So a search service like TypeSense, or something like Algolia or something. Not strictly like search in general, but like a a cheaper API to use than having to query Firebase directly, or query any database in general. Uh, that tends to bring costs down quite a bit, and also like the load on the database itself. If you're going to have a super distributed client base and they're all requesting the database at the same time, you want to prevent locks and stuff like that. So you could have a service like TypeSense that uh, kind of batches updates, and is able to deliver requests without having to touch the database at all.
Okay. Um, let's back up a little bit. You mentioned SQL versus NoSQL. What are you leaning toward? What's your thought process for what you're leaning toward?
Um, I I mean, I would reach for SQL because I'm most skilled at it. NoSQL, everything is super relational, I think, in Twitter. Like I see Twitter and I think, uh, about the relationships between all of these different entities. And I think you would get a lot of benefit from having, that ability to not request a whole object, but request like a piece of something, and where you kind of get stuck in requesting entire objects in a NoSQL way.
Okay. I think it's reasonable. You're trying to make this product in a year, and you've got your expertise now versus what might be ideal in a world where you had all of the expertise. Let's say. Okay, so you've got. I'm trying to think of what I want to drill into because we've got maybe like 14 minutes left before I want to talk about some of the conclusions from this. How about we table the database stuff for a second? I want to talk about compute. So you have these servers and something needs to tackle your tweets, something needs to tackle, what you mentioned, search, any other features you have. Uh, can you expand on just the general compute needs of this Twitter clone?
Sure. So yeah, you say you have 10,000 people pressing the retweet button at the same time. Um, that is going to have a huge load on the that'd be very taxing on a database if you were accessing it directly. there'd be locks, um, and it'd be a bad experience for all clients involved, except for the first one probably.
Hmm.
Um, so what you'd want to do is probably have something like um, a message queue, some kind of queue in general. But what I've used in the past is RabbitMQ um, to batch changes. It also gives you some resumability in terms of, if there's a delay, you're able to still collect information, process them in the order of the events that they came in, and then, you know, just return the notifications of what's happened to whatever clients sent them. Uh, on the scale of Twitter, I think you'd almost certainly have to have some queues in terms of actions because you're going to have many different clients changing, many different database shards, updating, you know, depending on how you orchestrate your final storage layer for the database, like some kind of master server that acts as like the source of truth.
Okay. I want to steer us a little bit more toward the compute side of things and not necessarily the data side. So uh, I recognize queuing is part of that for sure. But what kind of like at some point something needs to put a row into a database if you're going with a SQL database? Like what's handling that? How are you scaling this layer? What other things is this handling? How do you manage failures? That sort of stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So um, so you have a queue. So I would have a queue, in between the clients and the backend. Once you get to the backend, you have the backend receiving things off the queue.
Hmm.
Uh, you will have, you know, some kind of service that processes these requests and events. Um, that service should uh, that's like a layer in front of the actual database. So that service, does the processing. That should be pretty horizontally scalable. I wouldn't usually you wouldn't like your distribution would happen at the um, like the load balancer level and the CDN. I don't think you would have to have that distributed. That'd be a conversation we could have um, if we needed to have the backend closer. I think you'd have to have everything closer in front of that to make that decision. But yeah, essentially, you'd have a backend service. Um, you know, if I were writing it, I would have it in the same monorepo. But essentially, what do you do when this request comes in? This graph request comes in. Um, what action do you take? Those are all going to be hitting the database, but that process itself could have essentially like a worker uh, architecture where you could do something depending on the scale. You could do something like serverless, but what I would often do is more like um, a worker architecture that doesn't require that spin up time. uh, with tweets, you can make decisions like optimistic UI where somebody presses like and the like button turns red, um, and the client expects that that gets processed. But you definitely want to have a lot of ability to process simultaneous requests in something like this, a social network where there could be, I can't even imagine how many simultaneous requests you'd have to support for different events, actions, things like that. So you definitely want that layer to be horizontally scalable. Um, and because it's detached from the database layer, it's not really a problem to have that be the case.
Okay. I think that's good. I think the horizontal scalability is for sure important when it comes to something like this because you'll hit the maximum machine size you would have had for any vertical scaling pretty quickly. And Twitter probably has
Yeah.
some of those instances for who knows what. Uh, let's talk about some of the features again here. So when I add a hashtag to a tweet, I put in something like basketball, and then Twitter finds a way of accumulating all of the basketball tweets and says like, hey, here are the popular ones, or here's what you might be interested in. How would we get that feature to work?
Yeah, so you're going to need a some kind of search service. You're going to need probably like a the way that I would do it is a microservice for like recommendations based on some query. Are you? Can you repeat the situation again?
Yeah, sure. So on Twitter, you can put arbitrary hashtags in your messages. And I think what people mostly use this for is to find topics that they're interested in by what people have chosen to tag, but then also surface the tweets that it knows you might be interested in eventually, again, based on those tags. So you put something like hashtag basketball, and now we want to show you, like, hey, here's the new, whatever, I don't know, a game that just happened or some news that occurred. So
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
how do we show this to users or aggregate those?
You kind of would want you'd want something like a recommendation engine to be keeping track of the hashtags the user uses, user searches for, things like that. Those would all get aggregated into like some kind of profile um, based on it, so that you can one recommend content to the user. Like so, when you're building a feed, if you're not just gonna surface the feed of the friends, like if we're building modern Twitter instead of Twitter 1.0, where it's your feed is just the people you follow. Um, you would definitely want to keep track of the hashtags and types of users that people interact with
Hmm.
to recommend, uh, similar content maybe that would, I forget what it's called, but there's content that's uh, similar plus something else to like uh, expand the interest, like test expansion of interest,
Yeah.
so that you can market other things, get people into categories where you could deliver them advertisements that you have available. So yeah, that's, I mean, it's part of the advertising plot service, and it's part of the recommendation engine. I think you can kind of build those concurrently because they're it's basically gonna the advertising service is gonna be using the recommendation engine
Okay.
to
Um, I want to see if there's anything quick I want to touch on. I think let's talk about outages quickly.
yeah.
How would you make your service resilient to outages? And let's leave it open ended. I'll leave it at that. How would you make your service resilient to outages?
Yeah, so there's kind of there's some ways you could there's some different ways that you could handle that. One, we're already horizontal scaling as much as we can. Uh, if a node dies, route them to another node. That's all happening in the load balancer, that kind of stuff. Say a backend, say the whole backend goes down at the same time for 30 minutes. Uh, you could have a failover state where you have some version of the client that loads when the backend can't be communicated with. That either serves error messages or it serves things like um, statically generated content that you could serve users in the meantime.
Hmm.
Like as you go throughout the day, you could generate static content for users like as they're building it. So like as they're viewing the page, We build static content, we ship it to them. We could allow them to still receive that static content if the database can't be accessed. Um, we could still send things to the queue, like, if they make requests, that kind of stuff. It is confusing if you gather a bunch of events for a service that's down and then like the events all happen later. So you kind of have to do maybe there's a decision tree of like, if it's a micro outage, you allow people to still pop things into the queue. If not, then you start serving like, an error page or, static content, but inform the user that there's something wrong with the backend.
Okay. Um, Given that you said entire backend outage, this service that's accumulating static content is also part of the backend though, right? So
Mhm.
how is it that this didn't go down?
Well, so if the backend, like if say like the recommendation engine goes down, we can serve, you know, the content we've already generated, that's, cached on the CDN layer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can serve the uh, kind of like a preset content. Like if you want to have like stuff that you have prepared in this case, like, the top 100 tweets of the day, you can keep those cached on the CDN so that in the case that something goes wrong, you can serve them that so the users don't leave, that kind of stuff.
Okay. I want to kind of stop there only because we're at the time for the sort of interview part. So first,
Sure.
I want to say, this is a gigantic question, right?
Yeah,
Like,
there's a
how do
lot.
you make Twitter was not something that someone answered in 10 minutes originally. They just, you have an elevator pitch. So I think it's good that you touched on a lot of different things, and hearing your thought process throughout this is good it like reveals what your focus is at your current job and what your experience is. So I want to go through some of the things that I wrote down as we talk about this. One of the things, if I'm on the topic of what it sort of reveals, a lot of times you jump into the cost analysis right off the bat. And if I'm making a new product, that might be something I'm concerned with, but I think getting users and getting like a revenue stream and possibly getting funding might be more important to me than have I optimized my server costs for some particular service. The other reason for that being that you've got, 7 people in a year, and how are you splitting their focuses if you're like, hey, let's cut down on the cost of this? Is it pushing the deadline at all? So I'm gonna go back to the beginning. I wrote some notes here. You don't need to scroll through this. I'll do this. So let's see. For one, I think we were focused a lot on how you would build this without talking about what we would build first. So Twitter is probably much more massive than you or I even realize right now, even in terms of features, because you and I don't use it a whole lot. But there are private messages, for example, that we never touched on. There's the account sign up flow, and who knows, maybe you use other identity providers when you're signing up. Google, sign up with Apple, sign up. So knowing what it is we're even talking about before we immediately jump into, okay, we're going to support 3 platforms and we're going to have this as our database, I think that's good. And I think you started with it by asking, okay, what is, you asked some clarifying questions of like, okay, are we doing this on web or mobile? And again, this has to do with the breadth of the question. And I think it's hard to say, okay, here's exactly how I'm going to tackle things. But I think knowing, it's almost like writing a book, like knowing that, okay, here's the introduction. So I know that now I'm going to hear about these characters, and then hearing, okay, here's the expansion of this, and I hear a story arc and everything. If you could sort of anchor me to, okay, Twitter, we're going to build out, I think, just the basic Twitter functionality. You sign up for an account, you post a tweet, there are no tags, there's nothing else. Let's maybe start with that. And you'd mentioned minimum delightful product at some point too. I think knowing what that minimum delightful product is, how will we delight our users? And again, just kind of anchoring me to what you're building. By the way, interrupt me at any point if you'd like more clarifications on this stuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to sort of machine gun out all of my feedback.
That's great.
The next thing, and I think this is important for any system design interview, is to always talk about trade-offs. I think at first you sort of jumped immediately to, okay, we're gonna have a graph service, and that might be the best conclusion. And you might even know that Twitter had 4 different services and ended up at a graph service, such that you have the benefit of hindsight. But I, as an interviewer, don't know that you know that. So to know that you said, okay, well, look, we're going to consider this, or this. Here's why I would go with this. The other one would be better if we knew we had 3 years. This one would be better if we knew we had an infinite budget. This one would be better if we had 100 employees. I think knowing those trade-offs is like the key thing for any system design interview, because really at the end of the day, you can build a product by putting all this on one server and saying, hey, we're only going to handle 2,000 users. And Twitter can work that way. But if you value scale, then clearly it can't work that way anymore. So knowing those trade-offs, I think, is important. At one point, I asked you for some napkin math about the number of users Twitter has, and I saw your eyes go a little bit to your left, and I think you were looking up, and then you said 245 million active users, and I was like, okay, I'd like to hear you come to that conclusion, only because there are lots of times you won't know the answer to something and may not be able to look it up. But in general, I think interviews are about how you think, and knowing that you have access to that is of course good, but I'd expect you to be able to do that search. So yeah, saying
I was
something
unprepared for that. Like, how do you approach something like that?
So for something like that, I think it's almost like an algorithmic question of you break it down to a base case, or you tackle something that you already know. So for example, you might say something like, okay, well, we know that there are roughly 360 million Americans. We know that, maybe out of that many people, 20% use it, or 10%, or this many people have devices, or we base it on world population. Twitter is one of the most used websites in the world, and maybe you have a reference for like, well, Facebook is used this much and Twitter's not quite as popular. So any of those things would be good. And barring all of that, just saying something like, you know what, I know Twitter talks about scale constantly, so we got to assume it's at least 100 million people per day. Any of that sort of thing, just to make me kind of key into, okay. And by the way, you could say at any point, I would just look this up. I would do the research on this. But since I can't, or since I'm not allowed to use a computer or something for the interview, I think that would be good. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, so we talked about API stuff. In my mind, what I was thinking this whole time was whatever it is that the client uses to post is what a bot would also use to post. And you would just have an API token in the back end that would control what rates you have. I think you were thinking about this differently, and I wasn't totally sure exactly how. So I'm not sure if there's a disconnect there, but you'd kind of mentioned almost like having two APIs and then keeping the API separate from the application layer. I think whether you're using gRPC or whether a bot is using gRPC doesn't matter to the end user, and both would just be, API tokens accumulating somewhere in a bucket. Okay. Let me see. Oh yeah. So I wanted to hear some talks about cost versus speed. Again, you had a very cost-centric mindset, and a lot of the times you can pay more to speed up a process. Mm-hmm. So cloud services now, especially if you were to build Twitter on AWS, there are probably like 14 different practically tailor-made services that would really help you, including things like the load balancer, the CDN, CloudFront for the caching. Like you'd use all these things, and you probably, again, knowing they exist and saying, I might use this, but not focus too much on the cost originally. You even mentioned things like serverless Kubernetes. It's like Amazon has their fingers in every cloud service now and can provide these things. And so then when you started to mention things like Vercel and Netlify, I thought, I'm pretty sure Amazon must have an equivalent. And it's good that you know these things and that you use them. And given my original question of you have to build this in a year with your resources now, your expertise does factor into this a lot. This is not an aspirational like, hey, I just want you to build this platform. So I recognize there's that trade-off even for that. I think it's still something good to note. Again, trade-offs are just so heavy in system design interviews. The database stuff, the compute stuff, I think for me, what I was thinking of is more like your compute needs to live somewhere, and having it be horizontally scalable is an important facet of where how that compute is. But are you getting VMs and you're adding VMs to your pool? Are you containerizing your application and you're submitting this to like a Kubernetes cluster somewhere? Mm-hmm. Are you doing any other number of things? Do you have in-house servers at first and you eventually switch to the cloud? Those are the kinds of things I was thinking of. Kind of the same thing with the database is you're probably going to take some off-the-shelf database software at first, given that you're not going to write a database in a year. So knowing which kind of software I think is fine. And I think you touched on that well enough. I don't think there's a major problem there. Same thing with SQL versus NoSQL. I think it's good. You talked about, okay, here are the trade-offs. I know SQL. I feel like this is relational. I think you'd also maybe get into, there are very graph-centric databases, not GraphQL, but like the social networking kinds of graphs where you know that you'll have different kind of cache locality based on what you're pulling from. There was one other piece of this. Oh yeah, we talked about outages a little bit. something I was sort of trying to steer toward is your backend is hosted somewhere. And the way clouds typically break this up is what they call availability zones. So there's
Mhm.
US West, US East,
Right.
Asia, something, whatever else. When one of those goes offline, you lose everything in that bucket. But you have an SLA with your cloud service that typically prevents those things from going offline very frequently, or else they pay you back. So services that really need to scale, make sure that anything important is separated across these availability zones so that when one goes offline, everything gets redirected to the other. If you have a static generation thing, I think that was an interesting way of saying, okay, our database might be down. Maybe our caching layer is up. Let's try pulling from the caching layer. But it made me think a couple things. One, complexity in terms of, okay, now we need to build out a service that could potentially be resilient to this instead of offloading it to our cloud, which, by the way, even splitting across availability zones adds complexity. But it also made me think, okay, are you aware of these sorts of zones? Are you aware of the outages? And have you heard of, excuse me, chaos engineering?
Mhm.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, this is something Netflix does, which is they purposely instill failures in their system to see how it will react to those failures. And the failures could be at literally any layer. It could be network requests don't make it, your database is down, your application servers are offline, your load balancer is down, any of those sorts of
On
things.
prod,
What was that?
and they do it on
Yeah,
prod
they do it
too.
on prod because otherwise, how do you know that you have these issues and how would you know how to recover from them? Is there anything else? I don't think there's anything I had off the top of my head, although I was trying to keep notes of what you were saying. Do you have any questions based on the massive amount of things I just said for the last like 7 minutes?
There was one that stuck out that I like. Should I be treating the interviewer as like the oracle of the situation, like the not like the company oracle, but like somebody that knows all the truths about the reality of this? Like, is it okay to ask them like, um, you know, these like complex business cases of like where in the business is this idea, that kind of stuff? Like,
I think it's fair to ask anything that is a clarifying question about the interview itself. So, for example, if you were to say, look, I would prioritize this based on, um, I don't know, our investors, let's say, then you
yeah,
could ask the interviewer, do we have investors? Are we going to get investors? Like, that's fine. But if you were to say, like, what should I prioritize this? Given that we have, let's say, 1 million users, like, is scalability important? It's like, well, you should probably know then that scalability is important. So
right.
I think there are clarifying questions you can ask. And I think it's always fair to ask an interviewer and they might say, I want you to come up with that. That's the worst case scenario. But that lets you know that you're on the right track as well. So yeah, I think it's good to ask pretty much as many questions and just kind of keep in mind when it's sort of your responsibility to answer the question.
Okay. And then the cost benefit analysis that I was kind of like trying to integrate into that, is that like, should I ask how much money we have at the beginning in terms of like having to constantly pepper that throughout every decision, or is it like,
I think what I would ask is how important is cost? I'll touch on it. I'll say where we could make optimizations, but maybe they say, look, getting the product online is the most important thing.
okay,
And again, this is such a large question. There are so many things. At any point, I could have said drill into just the database, and we could have talked for 2 hours about that, and then drill
right,
into. But we spent maybe 5-10 minutes on each topic. So I think cost is one of those things that it touches everything because there's no way to just poof software into existence. You either get something off the shelf or you have someone develop it. So yeah, I think that's one of those things where you find out like, okay, what am I optimizing for, or should I come up with it myself? Yeah.
cool,
By the way, I want to say some other good things that you did. I didn't want to sound like it was just criticism. You kept a level head about this throughout the whole time. I think it's easy to get frazzled during interviews, and I hope it helps that this is a mock interview environment. You were talking and explaining what was going through your head. Again, that's really important. I think it's a little easier for system design interviews because there's no end algorithm you need to produce in the end. It's all just what are your thoughts and getting them out of your head. So it's good that you talked through that stuff. I think you also did ask questions where appropriate and you ask clarifying questions when you were either confused or a little off track or something. So I think that's good. I would keep doing that. Again, I sort of think the biggest takeaway, and this is for all system design interviews, is the it depends as an answer. Like that should practically always be the answer. and then saying why it depends and what it depends on, I think is good. Any other thoughts or questions?
um, oh man, I just had something that I think it just escaped. Um, Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. I'll if I think it's something, I'll put it in the chat later. But
Yeah, sure. So overall, good job. I haven't read chat, but they might have some suggestions as well. I wrote a lot of notes on this stuff, and I think, if I gave you any homework, it would be watch this again at maybe 1.5x speed or something, and just think, now that I'm watching from a sort of third view, how do I feel about this? Where would I have liked to see more? Because when you're in the moment, it feels very different, and you
Mhm.
have the benefit of having this whole thing be recorded. And yeah, I would probably take a look. But yeah, overall,
Oh,
good job. Oh yeah,
I remember my question.
yeah.
Just before we wrap, I named specific technologies that I had experience with. Should I be doing that, or should I be like being more vague? Like, is it a sign that you are trying to pigeonhole this product into something you're comfortable with, or is it like
So
uh,
there are
experience?
two aspects to this. One is I asked you a question that I don't think anyone will ever ask you, which is your team in 1 year. I want you to do this. At which
I like
point
that, by the way. I
you
think
like,
that's like
okay.
a good way. That's a good angle on it.
But it does make you pigeonhole yourself into the things you're comfortable with. So when listing things you're familiar with, the reason I think it's good, the two parts. One, know what category this thing fits into. So saying, hey, I use ELB on AWS. That's great, but say that's a load balancer. Like it's good to know so that I'm aware,
Mm,
okay, he's familiar with worker queues or load balancers or whatever. And then the second thing is, by knowing this specific thing or even the category of thing, that lets me know, are you thinking along the right terms? So if I said, hey, how would you solve a cost problem? And you're like, well, I would use, Firebase for that. And I'm like, what does that have to do with this? So that's where it would let me know. So I think it's fine to say those things. I think in general, I would use the terms like we need a load balancer. In the past, I've used,
yeah.
Amazon's. It seems pretty
Okay.
easy. So I would assume that other load balancers have the same capability.
So like name the concept and then talk about my experience with
Yeah,
using
something, and probably briefly, because I think it'll come through from whatever the rest of your answer is, if you knew this thing or not. I had one other big question for you, by the way, which is, was this along the line? Did you find this helpful? Is this the sort of interview feedback
Yeah.
and experience? Okay, yeah.
No, absolutely.
Okay, good. And my other piece of advice, I think, if you were planning on doing this for another company, I think doing other mock interviews and getting feedback from everybody is important. One of the things that sort of just sucks about interviewing is you could be the best at everything and get a team of interviewers who had a bad day and didn't really know this and was new at interviewing and whatever else, and then docks you points for things that you don't really need to be docked for. And as a result, getting feedback from as many people as possible to know what it is they prioritize is a good thing. I will share that in the past, I've done many interviews, but I did not do many system design interviews for other people because I preferred having like an algorithmic. I can judge you based on the time complexity and the, amount of space you use for those things. So,
Yeah.
but that's it. So thank you. This is a very different session from normal. Session 8. If you want to do another one of these things, definitely let me know. Otherwise, we can continue as normal. Totally doesn't matter to me, and you don't have to let me know
Cool.
now. So
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you
yeah.
very much. Thanks for preparing and working through it with me. It was very helpful.
Yeah, cool. Well, I had fun. Take care, Kyle. I'll see
All
you
right.
later.
See ya.
Bye.